Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda and I'm glad you could join me today. So today we have a video that has been eagerly requested by my amazing boyfriend. And quite honestly, I've been a bit reluctant to do this video because it's about somebody I don't know very much about. So it's about this man named Saul who changes his name to Paul, and what the Christian viewpoint is on him, because he's actually a really big deal to Christianity. He is the reason behind there's a Christianity actually. And in my 40 years of growing up in the United Church of Christ, we talked about Paul a little bit, but we didn't spend a lot of time on him. So I quite honestly was a bit reluctant to dive in deeper about him because I just didn't know much about him and I didn't see the purpose. So hence, here we have the video. I did some research, and today we're going to talk a little bit about this man named Saul that changes his name to Paul. We're going to talk about why he changes his name, and then we're going to talk about the view of Christians, and we're just going to talk about a couple of different denominations, how they view Paul/Saul, and we're going to talk about how the Islamic faith views Paul/Saul and how Judaism views Paul/Saul. And then that'll be the end of this video. So without further ado, are you ready? Do you know Paul? Do you know Saul? Do you know anything about this story? If not, tune in and we'll learn something together. Okay? Okay, so to start off, Saul was a Jewish man. So he was a Jewish man, he practices Judaism, everything. He was actually a very big persecutor of Jesus. He didn't like what Jesus was doing as a Jewish man. He was adamant that he was doing not God's will, and he fought against him quite hard when he was Saul. Then there's the story of a road to Damascus. And basically the story goes that Saul is walking on this road alone and he sees this light. And in the light was Jesus. And Jesus then tells him, commands him to preach and teach about the Jesus acts and miracles that were never performed for the masses. And after this event, Saul feels in his heart that, oh, okay, Jesus is now real, I understand, and he switches his name to Paul. So Saul is associated with the man who was persecuting Jesus, then he changes his name to Paul when he's going to follow Jesus. Okay, no one was around during this situation, nobody else saw it, nobody knows these acts of Jesus that were performed not in front of the masses, but Paul is now supposed to tell everybody about it. Okay, so 30 years after Jesus dies, 30 years. Now keep in mind, life expectancy at that time was not very old. It was typically 30, 40 years. If you got to 50, it was like, holy cow, you were really old. So 30 years after Jesus died, Paul starts organizing different writings and things, and he basically brings everybody's awareness about Jesus up again. The people who were following Jesus were Jewish people, and they kind of all dissipated and kind of changed their ways, and then they went back to being Jewish after Jesus died. Paul didn't. He waited about 30 years after Jesus died, and then he kind of like re-energized energizes everyone again. And he has this quote in Galatians 1, verses 11 through 12. And it says, I want you to know, brother and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. So he wasn't taught it. He wasn't told it. He didn't, he just got this message from Jesus 30 years after he died. Okay, so people definitely have differing viewpoints on whether Paul was somebody to be trusted, whether he was somebody who was a heretic and just outlandish and you should ignore him. And even in the Christian faith, some view him as a saint and some view him as somebody who destroyed Jesus' teachings. Because when Paul came back around and started rejuvenating people, he basically told them you don't have to follow God's law anymore. And that's what everybody was doing when they were Jewish. They were following the law of the Torah or the Old Testament, and they were doing that. But Paul said in Jesus, you don't have to do this anymore. You're excused from it, essentially. So it ruffled a lot of feathers. Now, two of the big things actually, that Paul is connected with. So he wrote a majority of the books in the New Testament. Well, majority might not be the right word, but he wrote about 13 of the books in the New Testament. That's a lot from one person. But he is the pinpoint person on Jesus Christ being referred to as the Son of God. No one else called him the Son of God. Nobody else even called him Christ until Paul did. Everybody else was just referring to him as Jesus. So that's a big change. Another thing that they changed was they changed the need for atonement. So the forgiveness of sin. So Jesus said, you don't have to be forgiven of your sin. Jesus didn't say that. Paul said, you don't have to be forgiven of your sins. Jesus already did that for you. So you don't have to worry about that. But Jesus was saying, yes, you do. So it changed things. Now, if you get your Bible out and you look to see, oh no, Jesus said this is that. Actually, the writer of that book is most likely Paul, because Paul is sharing his notes through that. But that's just what my research says, okay? That you don't have to follow the law of God anymore. So let's take a look at some of the Christian denominations and how they view Paul, okay? Because again, there's very many differing beliefs. That's a great statement, isn't it? So there's a lot of differing beliefs. And we're going to start with Catholics, and we're going to go through a couple of them. I believe I have 6 on my list. So the Catholic faith views Paul as a saint. So he is above a normal person. He is holy of holy, and not quite at Jesus level, but he's definitely above you or I would be. Okay. Now, the Catholics actually go as far to say that he is the most influential saints because he was like the first. So he's like the true believer. They also say that Saint Paul, as they refer to him, is the second most important person to Christianity, right after Jesus. Second most important person to Christianity after Jesus. So that's the Catholics and how they view Paul, and they view him as a saint. Now, it's interesting because in all the different religion or denominations that I looked into for Christianity, each of them views Paul slightly differently. So none of the rest of them view him as a saint. The next one that I looked into was the Lutheran denomination. And the Lutherans view him as a biblical theologian. They say that he basically recorded history, and he charted a journey of Israel from inception to fulfillment. And that's all he did. Now, keep in mind that he didn't start writing anything until 30 years after Jesus was dead. So things change. But that's how the Lutherans view it. They view him as a biblical theologian. That he just recorded history. That's it. The United Church of Christ says that Paul is just like any other member, and all members are part of one body, and we all have different gifts. So basically, they view Paul as like a cheerleader, but they don't place him higher than anybody else. Make sense? Okay, moving on to the next one is Methodist. So Methodist, if you remember, it's kind of like Catholic, but it's focused more on that personal connection. So the Methodist denomination views Paul as a missionary pastor. So basically he was a traveling pastor, and he went from place to place, and he spread the information that he had to share. Whether it was a true experience or an untrue experience, they don't care. It was him sharing his message. Okay, let's jump to the Jehovah Witness. So Jehovah Witnesses, remember, they believe in Jesus, but they don't believe he was the final Messiah. So Jehovah Witnesses say they want nothing to do with Paul. He's a false prophet. Keep him away. He has nothing to do, because he was essentially trying to bring Jesus and Christianity back in the mix. They didn't want anything to do with that. The Mormon faith tends to refer to Paul as an apostle, particularly the Church of Latter-day Saints. They refer to Paul as an apostle, but not one of the main disciples. So he was just outside of the 12 disciples, but he was an important person. They actually view Joseph Smith Jr., who is like the founder of the Mormon faith, and Paul as no different. So both very wise men who had these spiritual messages received, and they don't view any difference really between Paul and the leader of their faith. Okay, so that's interesting. Just if you look at Christianity's view on Paul, I mean, that's a lot of different viewpoints about one person. Now, if you look at the Islamic faith, they say that Paul was a self-appointed messenger, that it wasn't Muhammad that said he was an important person. He was self-appointed, and so thus he is a false prophet. So they want nothing to do with Paul as well. And then if you go to Judaism is what Saul was before he turned into Paul. And they basically want nothing to do with Paul, because when Paul came around, he basically turned everything on its head that was going on and said, this is what I'm hearing. And when the Jews started to question him, he said, fine, you don't want to believe it. I'm going to go to somebody else who doesn't know as much, and I'm going to teach them instead. So that doesn't speak very, very highly of the people at that time. And they got very angry that he was preaching against following God's law. Particularly, he said that like the boys didn't need to be circumcised anymore and things like that. And the people of the Jewish tradition got very upset at that. So that's Saul. He's very important to Christianity, not very important to Judaism or Islam. And even in Christianity, he's important because he started re-energizing the Christian movement. But many of the denominations in Christianity don't think super highly of him, or have kind of questions about what exactly was his purpose. So they haven't put him at saint level. But every denomination is different. So that's the story of Saul into Paul. There's lots of different opinions on him and lots of different beliefs. I have mine, and I'm sure you have yours, but hopefully you were able to learn a little bit of something today. And I hope you join me next time. Bye-bye.